Hi, and thanks for joining the Talking Animals Law and Philosophy series. My name is Raphael Fazel. I am the co-director of the Cambridge Centre for Animal Rights Law. This is our second event in the Lent term, and it's great to see so many of you here. And there's a couple of more people joining from the waiting room in a minute or so. For those of you who are here for the first time, I'll say a few words about how these events work. We will start with a presentation by our speaker that will last somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes. And we will then move to a Q&A or discussion session where everyone is warmly invited to participate. If you'd like to come in with a question or comment, I'd like to invite you to use the raise hand function. That way you can ask your question directly to our speaker, and it makes for a really interesting discussion usually. If you are unable to use your camera or mic, you can also pop a question in the chat, but I'll tend to prioritize people who can actually, raise their hands and participate via mic and camera as well. Everyone will be on mute until we reach the discussion part. We are recording this event, so if you'd like to watch it again later or share it with a friend, it should be uploaded to our website maybe in a couple of days or so. I think that's all as far as sort of how the event itself works, and it is now my pleasure to introduce our brilliant speaker tonight, and that's Melanie Challenger. I just had a wonderful chat with Melanie before you all joined the room, and she told me about all the many different things that she's doing. So I don't have the time, unfortunately, to cover everything. Look her up. She's a really fascinating human being doing so many different things, but I'll just focus on the more academic side here. So she is the Vice President of the RSPCA and Deputy Co-Chair of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics. She is a renowned writer on the history of ideas and the author of several books. Her latest books include How to Be Animal, What It Means to Be Human, which was published in 2021 with Canongate Books, and more recently in 2023 published with Bloomsbury, Animal Dignity, Philosophical Reflections on Non-Human Life. We're thrilled to have her here today with us, and she's going to be speaking on nature or the individual, who or what to represent first in politics and law. Melanie, thanks so much for being here.
Oh, thank you very much. That was a very kind welcome, and it's lovely to see so many faces in one or two people that I know, so it's nice to see some familiar names as well. Do we have the chat function up and running, Raphael? Because it might be nice, something that I like to do in this kind, we've got so used to the virtual room now, I suppose, but I always really love to know where people are from and what brings them here. So if people just want to, you don't have to, but if people do want to, while I kind of launch in, it would be lovely to just say a hi and know where you're from and what your backgrounds are. So I'm just...
It's up and running, so people should be able to do that.
Oh, wonderful. So I'm going to share my screen. Right, is that all showing fine for everyone?
Yes.
Great. So I'm not an academic, actually, as I'm often in sort of academic environments, so I do understand the pressures and the necessities of an academic life. But I'm a writer primarily, so I do sort of general trade writing, so much more public facing. It was through that work that I got involved in ethics. So I didn't train as an ethicist, but I was doing a sort of anthropology of science, if you like, around kind of history of ideas around the living world. I spent a lot of time with scientists in particular, particularly in biomedical sciences, cognitive sciences, and so forth. And through that work became concerned, and I'm introducing this to you for your particular kind of background in law for some of you. What I became concerned about was that we have a lot of technologies in the pipeline or underway already. CRISPR, I suppose CRISPR gene editing, precision editing being just one of many examples, leading to, for example, chimeric animals, or facilitating different kinds of research models like and strategies like xenotransplantation. I was having these sorts of conversations and concerned about, first, what the ethical framework could look like, and secondly, the through line to law and new kind of legal categories or conundrums. It was through that sort of practical interface with scientists that I ended up getting involved in this. And I guess that's how I'm here talking to you today, even though I actually came out of the creative arts. So this is a big leap for me from where I came from as an English student at Oxford through to talking on the human-animal, non-human-animal relationship today. So about 6 years ago, I joined the Nuffield Council on Bioethics. I'm now the Deputy Co-Chair, and I'm Co-Chair at the moment with John Coggan at the health and environment priority area within the Nuffield Council. And a lot of what we're doing at the moment is very much focused on how we might bring a sort of more of a multi-species lens to bioethics. So that's my sort of rough background. Vice President of the RSPCA, I'm one of a number of vice presidents, so that's how the RSPCA works. We're supposed to be the sort of high profile supporters, but I'm not really high profile compared to everybody else. I'm the only sort of non-celebrity, if you like, who's in that position, but I'm much more there to support the RSPCA in sort of grounding them back in the ideas, in the kind of intellectual history of how they got to where they are as a charity. And so it gives me, and has given me, a bit of an insight into the welfare landscape as well. So that's my background that I'm bringing to you today. And I'm going to take quite a sort of informal approach to the discussion, because what I hope to do is just draw on that unusual background that I've got to talk you through and give you some provocations about how I've started to think about the challenge of who we represent or consider first, the nature or the individual. And then I'll take you right through to the work that I'm doing now with a group called Animals in the Room, we're a non-profit entity who design processes to include the voices and perspectives of non-human animals, but we're also a research network who are an academic research network who are affiliated with us. So that may be a project that would interest some of you today. So I'm going to throw it out there. Anyone can unmute if possible, and if they know what the image is on my talk before we go further.
I'm afraid they don't have the ability to unmute themselves.
Raphael, maybe you, because I can't see the chat, maybe you can tell me if anyone is able to say.
Maybe they can pop it in the chat if someone knows.
Yeah.
Nothing so far, but we have plenty of people sharing where they're from.
Maybe someone could put a hand up if they know where it's
Someone
from.
says bristleworm, a sea creature.
It is a sea creature, not a bristleworm. Well, it's a woolly siphonophore, and I think this image is from Mbari, so Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, pretty sure, but it's a woolly siphonophore, and they can become enormously long. They can be the length of a bus, you know, that sort of size. And the reason I've picked a woolly siphonophore is because they are a colonial creature. So they are both an individual and a colony of individuals that reproduce clonally. So they're there again to remind us that who individuals are within nature can be a provocation to us conceptually, just in and of themselves. This is a picture of a wandering albatross, a juvenile wandering albatross at their nest on Bird Island in Antarctica. So my journey into the thinking around nature and individual and who we should consider and how we should consider non-human life, both morally, ethically and legally, began really back in Antarctica. So I was the writer in residence for the International Polar Year, oh gosh, I think 2007, long time ago now. And it was right at the beginning of my intellectual engagement, I suppose, with our relationship to the rest of nature. As I said, I began my life in the creative arts, and I was initially working in creative writing and classical music. I still work in those fields today. But my interest in nonfiction and in ideas and began really in trying to make sense of our relationship to nature and how we have become destructive to the rest of the living world. And I was really lucky to get taken down to Antarctica to work on the whaling industry. So I was there to understand the history of whaling in the region. So you probably know that was our first boom and bust oil industry. And South Georgia is a region where they were taking lots of different kinds of whales out of the water, particularly blue whales, large oil-bearing baleen whales that they would industrially reduce down. And one of the things that was interesting about studying the whaling industry was the way that we thought about whales and talked about whales. So you would measure the success of a season based on blue whale units or minke whale units, or and those were measures of the amount of fuel that had been generated and the monetary value. So this was a really embedded economic system in which a complex living organism had been reduced to a unit. That was their kind of metric and how they were understood. Obviously, we reduced that population down to such a degree that a moratorium came in. Eventually, there were lots of other historical factors at work, but one of the things that was provocative about that era was it wasn't really a shift in how we saw the whales that drove the change or drove the moratorium. It was that it became economically unviable. That was the primary driver. But there was a moment when some individuals began to calculate that you could probably just deplete the entire population of whales, put that money, the profit from that, into a banking system and generate more return simply on the accumulated wealth than you would trying to put in a viable, sustainable whaling system. So when I was there, I suppose what Antarctica did for me, what listening to Antarctica, which is this strange landscape that we think of as a kind of pristine wilderness. We go to Antarctica to pull out ice cores, to measure the climate, to understand our impact on the living world. But actually, Antarctica isn't pristine, and it's embedded with all of these leftover histories of our interactions with these landscapes, and also just our impact, because you still do get pollutants. You can even find leftovers in the ice of the atomic bomb. It's a landscape that speaks to us and speaks to the Anthropocene in lots of different kinds of ways. So that was really where I started to get a little more politicized, if you like, in my thinking, because I realized firstly how intense our impact was made very present to me as a young person in Antarctica, but also because I became aware of how difficult it is to build a political or a legal system that can really prevent the kind of exploitative, extractive economies from taking charge with regard to our relationship to nature. So what I've picked out here is, this is really here as a provocation for our talk. So the first was really just to give you a background of how and why I'm talking to this and why it matters to me as an individual. But to speak to what I'm specifically looking at today, if we want to do something to move away from the kind of impact that we're having, we have to obviously consider who and how we both give the foundation and frame our relationship to nature. So this is a kind of this is from a paper that was published by Stefan Zerber, and it just shows you some of the kind of frameworks that are most commonly used at the moment in the calls for representation in politics and law. So most often we're trying to move from anthropocentrism, so the humans being the primary foundation or the primary site of moral concern. Then we shift into sentientism or pathocentrism here. So moving out to a select group of organisms that we think are sentient or we perceive as being sentient. And we know that this is in discussion a lot at the moment. I would say, I don't know if anyone's done it, so maybe someone knows of a paper around this. I haven't seen one, but there probably is one of probably the curve that we might see of the increase in the word sentient being used or referred to. I would imagine we're looking at something a little bit like that. So we've gone from sentience, the idea of sentience being quite an obscure philosophical term with quite a specific history, to being one that we hear a huge amount now, and it gets used in lots of different kinds of ways. But broadly, in this kind of framework, we're talking about, for most people, it's animals that can feel, are aware of themselves and can feel their pain. So we're sort of expanding the moral lens to include those animals that we think have the capacity to suffer. And then there's biocentrism, where we're expanding the lens even further. So this then becomes about what it is to be alive. Does aliveness, being capable of having a life, being purposive in some kind of way, being agentive, having agency, extends our moral lens out to really most of the biotic world. So most living beings might come under a biocentric framework. And then finally, we have the holism, so the much larger framework that brings, I suppose we might think of the Gaia theory here. So bringing in our interrelationality, our interdependence with the rest of the living world, and even through some perspectives, extending notions of aliveness or sentientism into Earth systems, Earth features, rivers, landscapes, even for some, the Earth itself, is kind of the largest, if you like, most capacious at the moment ethical framework that we see considered at present. And what I've done is try to then overlay this with a sort of a history of ideas of how these sorts of frameworks that get used frequently today. So if we think of examples of holism, we might think of the rights of nature movements, Nature on the Board, the Non-Human Rights Project. If we think about sentientism, we might think more of work that I've been involved with, for example, on animal dignity, non-human rights, the Non-Human Animal Rights Project. If we think about biocentrism and holism, we might think about the movements towards ecocide, for example, and in sentientism, much more about welfareism. So in every case, though, there's this kind of tension at work that often isn't really addressed about whether we're looking primarily to protect nature or to protect an individual organism. And one of the concerns I have at the moment, I suppose, and why I've chosen this as a topic is because if we just look at one area, for example, we can see that there are often different but and connected, but sometimes conflicted approaches that all centre really on sometimes an unchallenged question of whether we centre nature, what scale of nature we prioritise, whether we centre nature or the individual. So if we look at the I'm really, really bad at doing, I've done this myself, at doing timelines, and in fact doing these kinds of infographics. So forgive me, everyone, for the fact that it looks like a child has done this, but I'm trying just to map here those frameworks with the sort of historical journey that has taken us there. So just layering time here a little bit. So obviously we talked about sort of holism. We might map that here to animism, to a really ancient widespread idea that nature is animate, that matter is somehow vibrant in some way, and that there's a relationality beyond just being an animal, or beyond even just being a biological being, but actually with the earth itself, that the earth and land are sacred, are sentient. And I'm getting some recommendations for adding. I should leave it on there for you to all scribble and add things to this chart, and we could end up with something really great, actually. But this has just been put together in quite a simple. I will have missed many things out here. But this is a kind of much really ancient idea. And then we move into monotheism. I've put it around 6th century BCE, but we start to get the idea of a sort of hierarchy becomes visible within the living world. And we also start to get the idea of ensoulment, of course, that carries through into the Enlightenment. And we sort of see reimagined or reworked as ensoulment in the mind. So we start to move from what is the bit of a living being, you know, that would be morally considerable, that would come to matter. We see a different pathway. So we go from the possibility that we're all related, that we're all ensouled, that even the land is ensouled, and therefore everyone has some sort of moral foundation available. We go on a kind of a lengthy sort of temporal contraction, if you like. We start to narrow through time. And one of the things that I imagine is that we sort of narrow, the soul kind of contracts into the physical body. It then contracts into the physical. If we think about Aristotle with the kind of vegetal soul and the animal soul and the rational soul, we've had a little bit of a contraction there from the kind of animistic perspective. Then we get a contraction into the human body in kind of certain debates around the substance of the soul and the nature of the soul in early theological belief systems, and Christian belief system in particular. And then we start to move to the Enlightenment, where we contract even further into the mind. The mind becomes ensouled, and that's the human mind, of course. And that's really where we've landed for a long time. So most of the moral foundation that we have, or what comes to matter, is the capacity to think in the way that we do, and to be conscious and moral entities in the way that we are, have the kinds of identities that we have. So that's all sort of overlapping with the civil rights movement. So we've got the rights of man coming in at similar kinds of times as John Locke and so forth. We've got emancipation coming in at 1807. And similarly, once going in then from the top, we get sentientism emerging. So we've got welfarism, the RSPCA, 200 years old, last year, I think. The focus much more on who can suffer, who can experience pain, and what duties we might have from them that flow. And that's all very much focused, of course, on the individual. We then come to the modern synthesis and Darwinism, where we have, which I'll come back to in a minute, but the reason I put them in there is because they were a really important moment where we shifted to a sort of gene-centric perspective. Why I bring that up is because with non-human animals, not with other kinds of animals, but with non-human life really, that contraction into the mind that I talked about shifts even further for other species into the genome. And we start to get the idea that what matters is the genome of an organism, the ability of the genome to to go on into the future, for us to have like viable genetic populations. That's a lot of conservation practice, and ecological approaches are based really not even on individuals, not on populations necessarily, but actually on genetic populations and historical and future genetic populations and their ecosystems services. We have the environmental movement, where we start to look at the much larger scale, at the kind of, we're getting more sort of holistic at this point in time. We're starting and biocentric. We're looking much more at the communities of animals or communities of organisms, ecosystems. And right now we have the indigenous turn. So we've looking to other older models of relationships with the living world that are much more holistic again. So we've had a real shift in how we are approaching things. And the reason I wanted to bring this out today is that I think what is really important is that there are huge numbers of underlying biases and assumptions, very profoundly embedded identities and histories that are always active in our decision making about the scale of nature that any of us might choose to prioritize. And going back to Antarctica again, I think one of the things that I took from Antarctica, from paying attention in that kind of landscape, is that it is enormously challenging to build our moral and our legal systems against a very, very highly complex living world. And one of the reasons, I think, just keeping in mind all the time the kind of history of ideas here, it encourages us to be humble when we start to think about how we would practically build out ethical or legal frameworks that are trustworthy, that are good at doing the work we want them to do in the world, that can build a fairer and more just future for all those beings that we might consider that we have duties to, or that we think morally matter to us. We have to always be aware that in some sense we're always being anthropocentric. It's very, very difficult for us to take our human glasses off and really consider the rest of the living world on their own terms. And as a provocation at the end of this slide, I suppose I would ask us, well, what would this look like if we had asked other species the question of what they would prioritize: the individual, the ecosystem, the nature widely, or their own species? We would get very different kinds of answers if we were able to ask that question. So one of the things that I think is important before we go into the question of how nature has become prioritized as a foundation within ethical or legal thought, we can't really get to that if we don't consider where the idea of the ecosystem came from. So Vladimir Vernadsky, I actually went to Vernadsky. There's a research station in Antarctica. That's the Vernadsky Research Station, which I went to many years ago, and I think was given vodka, as I recall. I don't think you could probably go there now, given our relationship with Russia. But Vernadsky was a Russian biologist, and he came up with, well, actually scientists more widely. He came up with the idea of the biosphere. So the biosphere, you've got a quote here from his book, The Biosphere. The biosphere is a unique geological force, the evolution of species and the development of human thought and natural geological processes that transform the face of the earth. So we owe really the idea of the biosphere as a kind of interconnected whole to Vernadsky. But Vernadsky was also very concerned with hierarchies within this system. So he did prioritize the human mind, and the idea that the next step for the biosphere was the dominance of the human mind as a transformative process, if you like, on the planet, a sort of rationalizing and kind of domesticating psychological force that would influence the future of the planet, and he saw this as a positive sort of progressive stage in the history of how the world works. And at a similar kind of time, a little bit later, we get Arthur Tansley, who gave us the idea of the ecosystem. And here we have another quote from him. So though the organisms may claim our primary interest, when we are trying to think fundamentally, we cannot separate them from their special environment from which they form one physical system. So really, Vernadsky's ideas and Tansley's ideas and those of others who were living at a similar kind of time give us our very system-based approach to the living world. And that really is the one that dominates most of the sort of conservation and even scientific kind of research into ecology, for example, is really coming from this very systems-based approach to nature. And what we tend to lose in that is the individual. I'm actually working on a book at the moment that's called Life is an Act of Rebellion. And really the whole reason that I've moved into that book, it's a book about where the agency, it's about agency in nature. So looking very much at causality and purpose in biology and trying to trace where that sort of purposiveness comes from. And how that affects the living world. But one of the reasons I wanted to do that was precisely because really until very recently, in most modelling of nature or ecological modelling, most work on ecosystems, we take very much a specific ecosystem scale. And what we lose in that is the individual. And for me, that's problematic because nature is deeply heterogeneous. It is made up of individuals that make very different decisions. And if you focus on agency in nature and we move away, as I was saying earlier, from a very gene-centric idea of what other living beings are, that they're not sort of like robots doing what their genes tell them to do, but they are complex agents who make sometimes unpredictable and very individualized decisions moment by moment in contact with the environment and other agents in the environment. If we take that very much individualized focus, the living world looks very different. So for me, I talk about psychosystems, for example, rather than ecosystems. What does it look like if we're not thinking always at this kind of nature sort of systems level that loses sight of the individual, but we're actually looking at starting with the individual and making sense of an ecosystem from the agency and unique decision making and actions of all of the agents that are there and that are present. And this takes us through then to the point that I guess I'm trying to make, or that I will be making as we carry on, which was how I started to think about this question of who we represent first. I began to think, well, who should we consider first, just scientifically, in the ecosystem? Do you start with a top-down approach? So you're really looking at assuming certain predictable actions will follow. Therefore, you start to see the system as being made up of predictable actions, predictable functions that organisms who are following their genetic the kind of instructions, if you like, from their genes and their particular roles within the ecosystem. And we see the ecosystem as this sort of stable state that functions when everyone's fulfilling their role within as the kind of species, the type of organism they are. If you have that sort of attitude, you've got to start by looking at having assumptions about the right way that ecosystem should work, and the predictability of entities within that ecosystem. But I started pushing back at that and thinking, well, what if we start from the individual level, and what if we look at the agency of organisms, and what if we start thinking about though the autonomy that organisms have, and the kinds of responsiveness that they have to their to the unique conditions and situations they find themselves in, then we have a bottom-up approach to understanding an ecosystem. We see an ecosystem as a process, as a very slow-moving wave, if you like, as those individuals make actually less predictable decisions. And as they are constantly shaping, co-creating, and necessarily changing the ecosystems of which they are a part. That leads us to a different kind of priorities that we can cash out ethically or legally. So in a sort of ethical or a political term, for example, would we represent the city of Cambridge before the citizens of Cambridge? And if we were going to represent the Cambridge itself, first and foremost, what would ground the reasons to consider Cambridge first? What would be the moral foundation for that? Do we confer the rights through something else? These are the sorts of questions that are coming up that we can't lose sight of the science behind them, but they're coming up all the time. So, for example, when we consider whether we should represent nature rather than the individual first, through a rights of nature approach, or through an animal welfare or a sentientist approach, for example, what are the moral foundations for choosing nature first? Are we conferring secondarily through humans, through securing rights for Indigenous people, for instance, or for stewards who would be spokespeople for other living beings? Or should we first be trying to enfranchise non-human members of the community, and what would ground their rights for representation, and how would we understand that? Scientifically, and particularly for me of concern, can we avoid using spiritual or cultural forms of representation? Can we simply work with what we know about living beings and the living world today? So this is, again, another of my provocations. What would nature say? As we know, it is extremely difficult to think through. I suppose I took the living world as my sort of inquiry a long time ago now, and I think about it every single day. I'm also an amateur naturalist. I spend a lot of time in the living world, observing other living beings, and anybody who has been to sort of wild places like Antarctica will know that these, when at liberty, nature is extremely complex and largely amoral. So it's always challenging for us to know what way we might start. But I think we can give ourselves some useful challenges that can get us along the way. So one of the first things that helps for me is really to give a foundation to moral considerability. So first of all, work out the logic and be really transparent with the logic. So who are we considering, and why are we making that kind of decision? And how generalizable is that foundation? So this really matters, I think, when we sort of move into both the ethical framework and the law, and also the language that we choose to use when we consider nature or the individual in nature. So is our approach one that is sufficiently generous to bring along publics, to bring along scientists, to bring along people of different cultures, different perspectives? Is it a foundation that is relies on a very specific cultural orientation? So as an example, if your foundation, your moral foundation is spiritual, or your moral foundation is religious, then today that's going to be relatively narrow in a lot of places around the world. It's not something that can necessarily be generalizable as a foundation. So when I consider moral considerability, I do, when it comes to nature, I do try to consider taking a scientific lens as much as possible. Not that science is neutral, but that it's one that we have the greatest chance of that being a generalizable foundation. So then the science, well, what's the best fit for what we know about nature? We still don't know anywhere near as much as we like to think that we do about the way that the living world works. I mean, just if you consider genetics as an example, I talked about that, we've only been able to really see inside the transcription process for a couple of years. So, and one of the kind of really detailed microscopic sort of insights into how transcription works within our bodies has only been possible for a year. So this is really new, that we've been able to really understand biological entities, how the life process works, what it is to be alive, and what it is to make choices. We're increasingly discovering that a lot of our assumptions about cognition, about consciousness, about sentience, about agency in particular, have not been quite right. And many of those old systems-based ideas that we had, so you'll have heard a lot about keystone species. That became like a really buzz idea that then translated into policy making, into sort of ethically embedded sort of frameworks. The key idea of a keystone species is as an animal that has, or an organism that has to be there because they then sort of have knock-on effects to the kind of successful functioning of the ecosystem. That's under real pressure now as an idea, because actually organisms are much more dynamic and complex than that. There's much more individual variation, and we in fact find that if you take those sorts of organisms, or you try to replicate the idea of that kind of keystone animal and their sort of functions that we expect them to be fulfilling somewhere else, it starts to fall apart. So we're in the process of always subtilizing and improving our scientific knowledge. But I think when it comes, we just need to bring that humility with us, that when we can't consider who has moral considerability, what the moral foundation might be, and who we should prioritize to represent in law or politics, we have to recognize that we have to ask questions then about what life is, about what we think ecosystems are, what we think nature is, who we think individuals are. And that is at the moment both changing on a kind of year by year basis, and deepening and becoming more complex, and also in some places coming much clearer. So it's clearer now that ecosystems are more processual. It's clearer now that intelligence is widespread and agency is widespread in nature. It's also clearer that there is a very particular and distinct difference between a living entity and non-living matter. We can see that now, but we've only been able to see that for a few years, but we can actually see that now. And that means that maybe, for instance, holism becomes a more problematic idea if we're going to follow the science than, say, biocentrism does. And similarly, anthropocentrism is under enormous pressure now. To a certain extent, so is also sentientism, and we can talk about this afterwards. And I think a final challenge to our thinking, obviously I haven't talked about trade-offs yet, but there's always trade-offs when we decide who we should prioritise or why we should prioritise an entity in either politics or law. But the one thing that I think we do need to recognise is that the interests of individual organisms are not necessarily aligned with an ecosystem, or we should certainly be asking if they are. So there's always a risk if we think we will just capture the interests of individual organisms by protecting or prioritising nature more widely or an ecosystem more widely. There's always a danger that we may flatten the interests of individual organisms who we may have moral duties to, or should certainly, whose interests and voices should be considered. So ways forward. I'll get more personal now. So my thinking on this is that we should be firstly wary of anyone who's making strong claims that there could be a one-size-fits-all approach here. So it's definitely not going to be the case that giving rights to nature, for example, will do everything that we could possibly need morally, ethically, or politically for the rest of the living world. And equally well, just following a individual organisms only is also not going to be sufficient to capturing that interdependence that we have with our environments. So what we probably need is a patchwork approach, of course, and also probably a very context-specific approach. And I think what we also need is to recognise we need to be experimental, humble, and we need to evaluate moving forward. That's what I would like to see, much more work with people cooperating and collaborating with one another and building slowly different kinds of approaches through to moral status. But if I'm going to get off the fence, my own research into the science of biology and the history of ideas about biology and how that could give us our foundation through to both moral and legal, moral considerability and legal status, is that it makes most sense to work from the individual up. Individuals are not straightforward in nature anyway. That's why I had the woolly siphonophore right at the start. So individuals don't necessarily look like you and me. We could think about a reproducing population like eusocial organisms, like certain kinds of ant colonies, as more like an individual. Individuals come in lots of different shapes and sizes within biology. But individuals matter for a very, very important reason for me from a biological perspective, in that it is in the body of organisms that the agency primarily flows. So it's through the prism of the body. You know, biology works in that very, very embodied way. That doesn't mean there isn't communication and openness with both the environment and communities within which an organism is embedded. But the actual physical processes by which an organism comes to determine their own interests, to know what is better or worse for them, to become that entity that matters, happens in the individual body. That's the scale that we can physically see it happening. It then ripples out into relationships with kin, relationships with community, relationships with other agents, relationships with food sources and the environment. And obviously, organisms are agents. They're constantly changing the environment based on the values that they develop within their own bodies. And those values can expand out into their communities. But we can make best sense of how to build the foundations in a robust and scientifically literate way, I believe, if we start at the individual and move upwards into communities, ecosystems, wider nature, if that becomes our logical movement through. And so finally, what am I doing about this? Well, about 5 years ago, I reached out to a range of different scholars who have called for political or legal representation or inclusion. That includes many individuals who you probably know or have heard of: Alistair Cochrane, Alfonso Donoso, Danielle Sellermeyer, Dan Weary in Canada. Lots of colleagues around the world who are in different ways calling for representation and inclusion of other living beings, and particularly as subjects of justice, as individuals who can determine their own interests and therefore have a claim to be included politically. So we came together about 5 years ago. We've been talking about the ideas and working through them for a long time. And what we do now in a group called Animals in the Room is design participatory processes that experiment with how we might represent those individuals or communities of individuals in participatory decision-making contexts, agenda-setting contexts, and governance environments. We haven't made the move into how that might cash out legally yet. What we're doing first is experimenting and researching and evaluating best practice models and methods for representation. But we are starting with an individual model, and I'm aware that you've got Danielle Sellermeyer speaking to you soon. So she's a part of our research network, a key part of our research network. So I'm sure she may signpost further along the line. But there's an obvious question just to end on here. Again, another provocation is the question of what does a good outcome look like? So why are we including? And what do we hope that will do in the world if we do represent, include, and find legal standing for non-human animals? One of the concerns that we have is, do we know how to measure what success would look like? So is a good outcome the same for us, for example, as it might be for an ecosystem? Is a good outcome for an ecosystem the same as it would be for individual organisms? These questions of the best way to consider and measure the success of outcomes is an open one at the moment. So I would love to hear your thoughts and feedbacks about that. And I'll end there with really just a series of questions and conundrums for us to discuss now.